That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a plan that God had before time in eternity past was completed at that very moment, at that very hour when he gave up the ghost on the cross. This is a pretty big deal. This changes all of human history, and it changes all of future eternity for people who have trusted Jesus Christ as their Savior. And so it says, so it was planned before creation. Revelation 13:8 says this, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. Now, if you know that in context, we've been talking about so many things taken out of context by my daughter. She hears me say that all the time, so she brought home some things. She did some Christmas cards, and they had some wild out of context stuff. They had some children's cards that said, precious in the sight of the Lord. Or precious, they're precious in the sight of the Lord. Well, it's a verse that says precious is the death of the saints in the sight of the Lord. Are you kidding me? And you're going to take that and apply it to a children's card and send it out? If they read the rest of that card, it's going to give the kids nightmares, you know. Precious is the sight of the Lord, death of the saints. Am I going to die? So taking things out of context. So in context, when it talks about, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, it's talking about they're going to worship the Antichrist. This is a terrible time in human history, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. As far as God was concerned, Jesus was going to the cross before he ever created the first foundation. We studied it in the book of Genesis and all the things that happened. God was not going to create. God does not occupy time. We think, well, God knows the future and God knows the past. Well, God's not in time, so he knows all things. It's going to happen, that have happened, and so on. And so in his foreknowledge, he simply said, listen, I'm not going to create the first tree, the first animal. I'm not going to make man because I know what man's going to do and I know how man's going to mess up. And my desire is for man to be reconciled to me. My desire is to offer man the kingdom of heaven. And so when Jesus gave up the ghost, he completed something that had been started and planned over 4,000 years prior to the day he died on that cross. We kind of have the idea, oh, he was born at Christmas, and he died resurrected on Easter. Oh, no. Before the foundation of the world, God had planned the greatest treasure for all of mankind, and that was our way back to God after man decided to disobey God in the garden. God in his love was not going to create a single thing till he created our path back to him. And so it was planned before creation, and it was promised in the beginning. Remember, we've been here on Sunday mornings, Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. He's talking to Satan, the serpent. It shall bruise thy head, meaning the seed of woman, the Messiah, the Christ. What do you do? How do you kill a snake? You got to crush its head. You got to cut its head off. You can kill all parts of its body, and it'll wiggle around, and it still will bite you. But once you crush its head, that snake's not going to hurt anybody. And listen, only Jesus Christ, the God-man, could crush Satan's power of death, hell, and the grave. And so he promised, and thou shalt bruise his heel, meaning that on the cross it would appear that Satan got the best of Jesus, but in the end, 3 days later, Jesus would get up and stomp his head, and he would win the victory. Not only was it planned before creation and promised in the beginning, it was promoted in the Scriptures. Remember, we talked about the Adamic covenant. God promised to Adam, I'm going to send somebody to pay for your sin debt. I'm going to send somebody so that this treasure in the field, so that this leaven in the bread, so that this kingdom of heaven can be yours, your greatest treasure. I'm going to send somebody. So he made a covenant with Adam, the first man. Then Noahic covenant comes along and he destroys all of man. And listen, if he destroyed everybody there, everybody that had been born in that first, I forget, 1,600 years or so before Noah and the flood, they would all died and went to hell because nobody would have ever paid for their sin. So he says to Noah, I've got to keep this covenant alive. So because of Noah and his family, man marches on. Then the Abrahamic covenant, we're right there, right now, just started in Genesis chapter 12. God says, now Abraham, I'm going to work through your family, and your family is going to birth a nation, and that nation's going to bring a seed, and that seed is going to be the one that's going to bring that treasure, the kingdom of heaven. So then we get to the Davidic covenant where God just continues this promise to David. And so Acts 2, 29 through 30. I could read verses for every covenant. I thought I better just give you the last one, Davidic covenant. In Acts 2, 29 through 30, Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost, and he's talking about this Jesus that rose again from the dead. And here's what he says. Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day. Verse 30. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on the throne. And the next verse talks about Jesus raising up. So David, who's in his sepulchre, who's dead, talked about his seed living forever on his throne because he knew there would be a seed, a Messiah, who would come. Don't know that he knew about the old rugged cross, but he knew a Messiah would come and do what God intended for him to do, and what God intended for Jesus to do was to give us that kingdom and that treasure. So listen, it was planned before creation. It was promised in the beginning. It was promoted in the Scriptures, and then it was provided on the cross. Colossians 1:14, in whom we have redemption through His blood, even the forgiveness of sin. Let me tell you something. This was a big deal when Jesus died. This is a big deal when He gave up the ghost. At that very moment, things began to happen to prove that this was not just the death of another man, a great prophet or great preacher or great teacher. This was something supernatural that was going to change the destiny of anyone who believed. Most people would consider death, especially death on the cross, life's greatest failure, not God's life's greatest success. I said it's Jesus' greatest achievement. Most people would look at that and say, well, dying on the cross, how is that? That's a great failure. However, some unusual events took place at Jesus' death to show that that at that moment was a divine victory, not a defeat. As Jesus gave up His life, the veil of the temple was torn in two in Mark 15:38. You know what the veil of the temple was? That was between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, and nobody but one man once a year could go in there. But when Jesus died, all people who believed in Him now had access to God. That was a big deal. That was a big treasure. That was a big opportunity that nobody had for more than 4,000 years until Jesus died on that cross. So as He gave up the ghost, and it's interesting because that curtain was woven. There were two curtains there, but it was each piece was woven. It wasn't sewn together. It was woven one piece. It was a hand's breadth. It was 3.5 inches of woven material that just ripped itself in half. I don't know if you know about that, but the hand breadth, 4 inches, on nearly 4 inches, 3.5 inches of material is serious business to try to rip without a very sharp knife or something to cut it. And it just torn in two because the access to God was laid open. Also an earthquake. Graves open. You won't find this in one account. You'll find this in 3 different accounts. There's all these different things that took place. So in Mark 15:38, the curtain was torn in two, which appears in the other accounts. But in Matthew 27:51 through 53, an earthquake, graves opened, bodies of saints that slept arose. And you know, sometimes we go through that quickly and we think, well, when Jesus died on the cross, people appeared to their loved one. Not exactly. And all these years, I never noticed this. Isn't it weird how you just noticing things all the time? It says here in verse 27, verse 51 through 53, verse 53 says, and came out of the graves after His resurrection. So on the day He died, graves were open and saints came out, but they weren't running around the city showing off. But after His resurrection, it says, and went into the holy city and appeared unto me. Because what is Christ doing? Christ is gathering Abraham's bosom and He's taking them to present them to the Father. He took captivity captive and He took them, and they were no longer in Abraham's bosom. Now they're with the Father, to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord. He's at the right hand of God. And listen, not only when He did the temple rent and there was an earthquake, but He took all the souls that were in Abraham's bosoms with Him and present them to God to live with God for all of eternity. This is a big deal. It's a big deal. We get used to hearing about it and thinking about it, but this is what the Scripture says is taking place here. Not only that, darkness covered the earth for 3 hours, according to Luke 23:44 through 45. Luke's the one account that tells us about that. God turned His back on His Son, suffering for our sin, and God said, I don't even want to see it, and I don't want man to see my Son up there suffering the brutality and the death. All 3 accounts say, the first account we read, Mark says it twice, the beginning and the end, He gave up the ghost. All this happened at the very moment. It didn't happen while He was dying. It didn't happen while He was being crucified. It didn't happen while He was the nails were being driven or any of that stuff. At the moment of His death, all these things happened because something that had been prophesied for over 4,000 years, the salvation of every man, woman, boy, girl that ever believed, ever made a sacrifice, ever was looking forward to Jesus' death. And now for everyone that would ever look back to it, God had given the treasure of salvation. And so he gave up the ghost. The veil of the temple was rent, as mentioned in several of the accounts. And in most every account, the centurion confessed that Jesus was someone very special. Mark, he says at the end of the whole account, truly this man was the Son of God. Luke, certainly this was a righteous man. Matthew 24:34, it says, now when the centurion and they that were with him, it wasn't just a centurion when they saw this, watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things which were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly this was the Son of God. Jesus did a lot of great things when he was on earth. But the greatest thing he ever did was when he gave up the ghost on the cross. When God died for man. When he died for you and I to give us access to God's kingdom so that we could live under God's authority and God's rule, not only in this life as a believer, but in the next life for all of eternity. Jesus knew that what would seem to others a tragic defeat was really a grand triumph. The cross was his greatest achievement. Secondly, not only Christ's greatest achievement, but it's our greatest example. Hebrews 12:1-2 says this, wherefore seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight. There's a lot of things in life that aren't a sin, but they're just a weight. You ever try to run? I remember when I was in track, I'm not built for track, all right? Not tall enough, no legs for track. But the guys who were good at it, they would put ankle weights on, but they never ran a race with those weights on. They took those weights off, they felt lighter, they felt faster, and too many Christians are running with extra weight. And it says, every weight and sin, which does so easily beset us, that's which surrounds us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. And verse 2 says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and was set down at the right hand of the throne of God. These scriptures are presenting our life of service to God as a race that an athlete would run. We are to run with patience, looking unto Jesus as our example. He gave himself entirely. The cross was pervasive in his life. It touched every aspect of his life, even though doing it brought shame to him in the sight of others. So the reality is, if Jesus is our example, then our faith should touch every aspect of our life. It should be valuable enough to sell all that we have. And again, I'm talking about it in a metaphorical way in the parable that he gave. He gave himself in this fashion because of the joy he knew awaited him, because he was going to be at the right hand of his Father for all of eternity, but he was also going to bring all saints of all ages there with him because of his death, burial, and resurrection. So for the joy set before him, he endured the shame, despising what was going to take place. Jesus is our greatest example. In our life's race, he taught us the greater worth of eternal things and earthly things. If we're going to spend our life under the banner of this rather than the banner of this, it's going to get in the way of us being willing. And you know what? Are we willing to suffer shame? Are we willing, people look at us and say, what a wasted life, because we're not living like the world. They looked at him and said, look, he died. What a needless death. Even though he resurrected stuff and God began to work, there were still many that thought, look at that religious leader. Look what happened to him. But all these thousands of years later, what impact has Jesus had? And in eternity, all those who are in heaven versus all those who are in hell, listen, you may not see right now, but if you can believe God and let that cross impact your life, your treasure is far beyond anything you can imagine. Thirdly, the greatest sacrifice. 1 Peter 3:18 says, for Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. Without sin, innocent of all charges, he suffered death in order that we might be brought to God, reconciled and redeemed because of him. The Bible says the just dying for the unjust. He acted in the behalf of others rather than his own behalf because of his great love for us. While we were yet sinners, offensive to him, he died for us. So not only was it a great achievement, not only was that a great example for the joy that was set before him, for the things that he was going to get, he showed us that we have to make sacrifices for what's ahead. If we believe the value, if that is the greatest treasure, then you have to pay some price for that treasure. He also showed us that it was the greatest sacrifice. And lastly, it's the greatest priority. 1 Peter 4:1-2 says, for as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. Now, there's no need for you to die on the cross for anybody's sin. You can't do it. But the same thing that we witness in his example, the same sacrifices that he made, the same attitudes that led him go to the cross and die in our place, ought to be in our minds and our hearts when it comes to our treasure of salvation. So it says here that Christ has suffered for us in the flesh. Arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Verse 2, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. So we get to the point that if we understand the value of what Christ did, that it was his greatest achievement, and it was his greatest example, and it was the greatest sacrifice, and now the greatest priority is that we should live in obedience to this rather than letting this or anything else. I mean, money's just one thing of many that to run our lives, that we ought to have an attitude that life's greatest treasure is our relationship with God, and we ought not to let anything else become a priority over that relationship. But to do the will of God. And so we are to have the same mind Christ has. We are called to live with the same mindset as Jesus, as described in previous passages, willing to undergo shame, pain, and loss of what the world considers important. How many Christians are really, I mean, including me, how many of us are really ready to go through shame, pain, and loss? We talk about glorifying God, and I think about it. I talk with the Lord in times of prayer. I said, Lord, would I really be willing to glorify you if you gave me a terminal disease? If you crippled me, if that's how you would get glory in my life, am I truly ready to suffer that kind? That's what Jesus said. So I'm just saying, I don't know what God's going to call us to do, and I wouldn't go signing up for running out in front of a truck or anything. But I'm just saying Jesus' greatest achievement, our greatest example, the greatest sacrifice of God for man should give us our greatest priority, which is the kingdom of heaven, which should be pervasive. The cross should touch every aspect of our lives, more so certainly than money does. We should not be living by the same economy the world is living by. Our objective in life is to please God, not self or others. In all aspects of our lives, we are to march under the banner of the cross, life's greatest treasure, rather than the banner of the dollar sign. The cross gives Christians greater priorities than material gain. So Jesus' greatest achievement was the cross. Our greatest example was Christ. The greatest sacrifice was the crucifixion. And the greatest priority is our consecration. What's consecration? It's just meaning that our lives belong to God and we live like they do. And so we could just get up here and say, oh, your eternal life is your greatest treasure. But I think it's our greatest treasure because you can see how God planned it from before the foundation, how precious it was what Christ did, what an example it set, and how that ought to influence our life. And so God is teaching us that this has to be our greatest treasure, not this. And the world would say, you got to have this, you can't live. And I understand, Christians, you know what, you're not going to eat without this. You can go show everybody this all you want, you need some of this. But this should be the thing that you consider life's greatest treasure. And you ought to consider this God's blessing, but not as equal to this treasure. Because you know what? One day, we're going to leave that behind. All of it. Bank accounts. And Solomon says, and you don't know how your kids are going to spend it. But this is the one thing that goes with us for eternity. So enjoy your blessings, but don't ever be mixed up about what your greatest treasure in life is. It is the cross. Christ's example, the cross and his crucifixion, and our consecrations. Life's greatest gift, Matthew 13:44, is the kingdom of heaven, which was purchased for us by his crucifixion on an old rugged cross. If you have your prayer list tonight, we're going to look at that and then have opportunity for you to pray as we're closing. And then after you pray, you can slip out. And if you're by yourself, find somebody to pray with. If you're there together as couples or three,